Welcome to everyone for joining today's webinar. Today, I'll provide a basic introduction to developing agency-specific retention schedules that will cover what an agency-specific schedule is, the review and approval process, and how to complete the required forms. As a state agency, there are two sets of schedules you will need to be concerned with: the State General Schedule and your own agency-specific schedules. Unlike the State General Schedule, which is developed by the archives and covers records common to most state agencies, agency-specific schedules are developed by the agency for records unique to that agency and are tailored to the specific needs of an agency. When devising a schedule and thinking about your records, the most important thing is knowing the records in your agency that need to be scheduled and involving appropriate staff. This requires careful planning to coordinate the process. Also, think about how long you want or need to keep the records and when to destroy them. Archive staff will advise based on their knowledge of other agency practices, records management standards, and research needs. To create an agency-specific schedule, you complete a triplicate set of forms called a Records Disposition Request, or RDR, and you complete one set for each program unit. Once the RDR has been approved, it is referred to as a Records Disposition Authorization, or RDA. When should you submit a Records Disposition request? There are several possible scenarios. When you need to add a new record series, for example, you completed a records inventory and found records that haven't yet been scheduled, or new legislation adds responsibilities to your agency, which will result in new records being created. You may also find that a general schedule item exists, but it doesn't fully satisfy your agency's administrative needs. You might also wish to cancel an obsolete RDA or update an existing RDA, either by superseding or amending it. I will discuss this process in more detail in a later slide. Now let's turn to the nuts and bolts of putting a retention schedule together. There are three basic forms which must be completed: a Records Disposition Request, or a Rec3, a Retention and Disposition Schedule, a Rec4, and a Record Series Description, a Rec5. The Rec3 form is a cover sheet for the Rec4 and Rec5 forms and must be signed by the agency RMO. The Rec4 is a summary of retention and disposition proposals detailed in the Rec5 forms, which are also used for collecting information about individual record series. We will examine each of these forms in turn. Individuals beginning this process will want to start out with the Rec5 form and save the other two forms for later. Start with the Rec5 form, which should be completed for each record series. The form captures information about the records so that current and future agency staff understand how to manage them. It includes a basic description, which provides information on the function and types of documents in the series, and it also defines other aspects of records. For example, the format of the record, such as paper, electronic, or microfilm, as well as the date and volume of records. But the three most important elements of a schedule are when a record becomes inactive, how long to keep a record once that occurs, and what to do with it at the end of the retention period. The retention period will typically begin when a record becomes inactive, or no longer regularly used, or not used at all, and many records become inactive after a particular event occurs. Examples of common events that cause records to become inactive include expiration of a contract, settlement of a claim, completion of a project, completion of an audit, or termination of employment. Think of what event makes sense for a particular record series. If nothing seems obvious, then you can just put end of the calendar year in which they were created. How long do you keep records after this event? Even though records may no longer be active, there still may be some need to retain them for a period of time. Talk to unit staff to determine what their needs are. There is administrative need, how records are used for reference, planning, and decision-making. This is generally the major factor in determining period. There may also be possible legal requirements. Review applicable state and federal laws. Most records have no legal requirements, though some do. For example, OSHA requires that records relating to exposure of individual employees to toxic substances be retained for 30 years. Finally, check for possible fiscal value. Determine what records are likely to be relevant to state, federal, and internal audits, and what are the time limits for when records can be subjected to audits. For long retention periods, consider storage in the Record Center. The REC5 also addresses how records should be handled at the end of the proposed retention period. There is destroy, which is the case with most records, or transfer to the state archives. This is for records with long-term research or historical value, about 2 to 3% of agency records. Archive staff will need to evaluate these records to determine if they are archival. Also, there is the other. This is almost never used, but check if the other two options don't fit. For example, if some records in the series are to be destroyed, but others are to be transferred to the state archives. Finally, briefly explain the reasons for choosing the proposed retention period and disposition for that record series. Cite any federal or state laws or regulations that determine retention. The Rec4 is a summary of the retention and disposition proposals from the Rec5 and should include information on the title, description, and retention and disposition plan for each record series. You should briefly summarize the proposed retention and disposition of records in the series as indicated on the Rec5 form, including the minimum length of time the records must be retained, the event that commences the retention period, and the final disposition of the records. You need to complete only one Rec4 for each program unit within an agency, listing all the proposed series for that unit and using as many pages as needed. The Rec4 could also be considered and used as an office schedule, particularly if an agency includes pertinent general schedule items on it. Finally, the Rec3 is a cover sheet for the Rec4 and Rec5 forms, so one Rec3 should be used for each program unit schedule. The Rec3 is used to explain the mission and function of the program unit, document what scheduling actions the agency wishes to take, and document the review and approval of the schedule. Requested agency actions include establishing a schedule, adding items to an existing schedule, revising an existing RDA, and other, which often amounts to canceling an existing RDA. The form also provides a summary of action taken after submission by the agency, showing when the schedule was received, when it was sent out for review, and when it was approved. Please note that the Rec3 must be signed by the RMO in order to be approved by the state archives. A signature constitutes agency RMO verification that retention periods on the proposed schedule are sufficient to meet legal and fiscal needs for the records. Also note that faxes, scans, or e-signatures are not accepted for the Rec3 form. The state archives must receive a signed hard copy through the mail. On the other hand, we encourage submission of the Rec5 and Rec4 forms electronically, preferably in Word format. This makes it easier to provide comments to agency staff, as well as make any necessary corrections. There are a few things to keep in mind when completing the forms, particularly the description field. RDRs will be reviewed and approved by individuals who are not necessarily familiar with your records, so the description should include information regarding the types of documents in the series, as well as the purpose of the records. Context is important to provide an understanding of how the record series fits into the overall function of the program unit. For similar reasons, it is important to spell out any acronyms. While they may make sense to you, they may not to reviewers or future agency staff. For instance, NRA might refer to the National Recovery Administration, though others might assume it refers to the National Rifle Association. You should also avoid terminology that would date and limit the RDR, such as using specific form numbers, specific software application names, etc. This can result in an RDR becoming quickly obsolete and necessitate a revision. Finally, you should include all formats for a particular series, for example, paper, digital copy, microfilm, into one REC5, even if they have different retention periods or disposition. Do not schedule electronic records separately from their paper counterparts if they belong to the same series. Once completed, each RDR needs to go through an established review and approval process. First, the RMO submits them to the archives for review and to finalize. Archive staff will provide feedback to strengthen the forms and improve their chance of approval. As such, we may suggest revisions that require additional work by the unit, so there may be a lot of back and forth between agency and archives. This is followed by a review of the RDRs by the state archivist. Keep in mind that the agency should also have its own internal review of draft RDRs by program unit staff, legal counsel, and others as appropriate before they are submitted. After the state archives review the RDRs, are sent to the Attorney General and Office of State Comptroller for review. This is done to ensure any fiscal and legal requirements are met. The AG or OSC sometimes requires certain changes or additions to the RDR, though this is uncommon. Regulations specify that the Attorney General and State Comptroller have 30 days to complete their review. Finally, the RDR is approved by the state archivist. This can be done no less than 40 days after it is initially sent to the Attorney General and State Comptroller for review, but once final approval occurs, then it is officially issued as an RDA. The state archives will then notify you of approval, and you may start using it to dispose of records immediately. You may also find that you need to update your existing RDAs at some point, as agency functions and the need for certain records sometimes change. So a good place to start is to periodically review existing RDAs, as well as to conduct periodic records inventories. RMOs are responsible for keeping an up-to-date records inventory, and an inventory will also help keep your schedules up to date by identifying obsolete record series, that is, records no longer produced by the agency, or series that require some change in retention or disposition. If you have found that an existing RDA needs to be updated or revised, there are several options available. First, there is supersession, which is a complete replacement of an existing RDA. This would be required if there are significant changes to an RDA, such as a change in the function of the records, or if your agency proposes a decreased or significantly altered retention period. This is one of the most common reasons for supersessions and is usually based on changing administrative or legal needs for the records. For example, an agency may have originally scheduled a series of project files for destruction 10 years after the completion of a project, but after a few years, internal processes change, and agency staff realize they don't need to keep the records for quite as long. So they submit a request to reduce the retention period. Another example might be if an agency decides to scan records from a series and destroy the paper originals. This action would be considered a supersession of an existing RDA, since it would significantly change the disposition of the records. Supersessions follow the same review and approval process as the creation of new schedules, including external review by the Attorney General and State Comptroller. The series will also be assigned a new RDA number. Another option available is to amend an existing schedule. Unlike a supersession, an amendment is appropriate if there are only minor changes to an RDA, such as a small change in the description or series title, or perhaps in the volume of records. It is also used if an increase in retention period is proposed rather than a decrease. Because the changes are minor and/or the retention period will be longer, the amended RDA does not have to go out for external review, but is simply approved internally by the State Archive Scheduling Unit. However, you still need to submit a signed Rec3 form with this request. And unlike a supersession, an amended RDA retains the same RDA number. A third option is canceling an RDA if you find that records are now obsolete and no longer produced by your agency. This is actually quite common, and many agencies still maintain active RDAs that date back to the 1950s and 1960s, which cover records no longer created, or whose function has long since become obsolete. To cancel an RDA, the RMO simply needs to submit a signed Rec3 form indicating which RDAs the agency wishes to cancel. Agency staff will then need to determine that all the records covered by that RDA have either been destroyed or, if scheduled as archival, transferred to the state archives. It should be noted that if an existing RDA covers archival records that have yet to be transferred to the state archives, that RDA cannot be canceled. And finally, you may discover as a result of your inventory that there are records not covered by an existing RDA. In such cases, you may wish to develop an RDA to cover them. So that covers the basics of scheduling and should provide you with the tools you'll need to successfully develop and manage your retention schedules. If you have any questions, you can send an email anytime to the records management email address listed on the slide, and a state agency advisor will contact you as soon as possible. Thank you for attending.